I'll try and keep this video fairly brief, but it's something that I really want to comment on. One, to draw your attention to it, one to draw your attention to something related to it, and one to pass comment on it. So, okay, let's think. Right, what I want to talk about is Rebecca Watson's talk, her speech at Skepticon this year. It was about evolutionary psychology. It was not a very favourable talk. It's not a talk that you would expect to go down well with an evolutionary psychologist, it's got to be said. She was very dismissive of the field of evolutionary psychology, almost in totality. When somebody asked at the end of the talk, does she think any good research has been carried out in the field, because the examples she gave were the most trivial, most ridiculous examples that she could find, she just laughed and kind of semi-scoffed at the idea and said, well, there may be, but it will be very boring, because the only way you can make this field interesting is to make shit up. Which was a rather alarming thing to say. I don't know if she applies that kind of reasoning to any other fields of evolutionary research and evolutionary biology. I'd be interested to know if she feels that way, because you can certainly, of course, dress all these things up in this way, and the kind of just so stories and the kind of problems she has with evidencing, as I mentioned in a video a few months ago, applies to many other examples within evolutionary biology. It's quite easy to see sometimes and to understand that something has evolved by a process of natural selection, for example, but trying to work out what the selection pressures involved were is sometimes intractable, and so that even if we do suspect that some characteristic, some mental characteristic could have evolved, trying to work out what those selection pressures are, well, we're going to be at least as much in the dark in this field as we are in any other field of evolutionary biology. But that doesn't totally dispute the idea that these things could have some kind of biological basis, does it? What I want to do is to commend to you a blog piece that was written in response by a guy called Edward Clint. It's a very thorough piece. It's very well worth reading, and juxtapose that piece and look at it in conjunction with and place it alongside and in opposition to the talk that Rebecca gave. So I will link you the talk that Rebecca gave. I will link you the blog piece. What was slightly alarming with regard to the blog piece was P.Z. Meyer's reaction to it. He said he just dismissed it on the grounds that Edward Clint has had some issues with Rebecca Watson in the past. Now, let's try and be a little bit critical here. Rebecca Watson has done a talk trashing a whole field of research. Edward Clint is involved in the field of Edward Clint. Well, maybe he is involved in the field of Edward Clint. He will be to some extent, but he's also involved in the field of evolutionary psychology. He's invested some years in it. One would suppose he may well invest his entire working lifespan in the field of evolutionary psychology. Doesn't that perhaps give him another, perhaps a greater reason to take issue with what Rebecca Watson said, over and above any personal issues that he may have with Rebecca Watson? I suspect that it may do. P.Z. Myers obviously doesn't think that working in a particular field would lead you to want to back up and defend that particular field. Though I suspect if somebody invested the same kind of vitriol and smirking dismissal to what P.Z. Myers does, I'm not quite sure what P.Z. Myers does do other than sit in his office and fucking tweet all day, but I believe he does carry out some research. I'm sure he would have the same kind of desire to defend that field. Now, I don't want to go over the stuff that Edward Clint talks about, one, because he goes over it much better than me, and two, because he goes over it much better than I can. But I did want to talk about one particular thing which was a real head scratcher with regard to Rebecca Watson. So what I'll do is I'll prelude that with a tiny little clip of Rebecca Watson, and we'll take it from there.
So it's all good to chuckle at the bad science, but what is the harm in bad science that perpetuates stereotypes of men and women? I'm glad you asked. I mean, I'm glad I asked for you, because you don't have a microphone. So there are a lot of ways that stereotypes screw us up. One is that they're sometimes used as the basis to limit our own rights. It's also used to excuse predatory behavior, like men evolved to rape. Maybe you heard of that one. Newsflash, was bullshit. But it was used as a sort of, well, you know, it's natural for men to rape. Therefore, we don't really need to look into ways that we can change our culture to stop men from raping. It's natural.
Okay, so this was the part of the talk where Rebecca really got down to brass tacks. Prior to this part of the talk, she'd given the reasons why she has no time for evolutionary psychology. Now she's giving the practical implications of it being wrong, of making these erroneous claims. Or at least that's kind of how it's dressed up. But what she's actually doing is giving the concerns, the practical concerns that would exist whether the claims were true or not. Think about what she said, the example she gave, the rape example she gave, and about how it's used to excuse predatory behaviour. That same excuse could be made whether the claim is true or not, whether there is a biological basis, whether there is some kind of biological predisposition that could exist, which would confer some reproductive fitness advantage to having some predisposition perhaps to rape in certain sets of circumstances. It doesn't depend upon the falsehood of the claim. Now that gives me a slight worry, slight concern, because let's say these claims were true. Does that mean that we should still insist that they're brushed under the carpet, that they're hidden away in some corner, lest people, you know, use them to justify things that we don't want them to justify? But the thing I really want to talk about, or the first of the two things I want to talk about, she said in the speech, note, she said used to excuse predatory behaviour, but the slide says used to excuse predatory behaviour via the naturalistic fallacy. Well, what should really be her concern here? Should it have been the claim that the evolutionary psychologists are making, or should it be the fact that people are using fallacious reasoning? Generally, if somebody's using fallacious reasoning, it's the fallacious reasoning that we take issue with, because if you're gonna use fallacious reasoning, you can use any bit of research, accurate or inaccurate, to justify anything. Perhaps the most obvious and relevant example of this I can give is the way that creationists look at the whole field of evolution by natural selection and say that this can be used to justify eugenics. Of course, yes, it can be if you employ the fallacious reasoning and go from a process, a natural process which isn't goal-driven, and say that that in some way justifies a process which is determinedly goal-driven, which eugenics, of course, is. If you're going to allow fallacious reasoning, if you have no problem with the fallacious reasoning, then the case that Rebecca Watson makes is entirely justified. Personally, I take issue with the fallacious reasoning. The example that she gives of rape, and she says, well, if we believe that rape has some natural or predisposition to rape, may have some biological underpinning, then in some way we are justifying rape. That's absolute bollocks. We accept, I think all of us understand, there's a biological underpinning to why adolescent men are more aggressive and violent than old grandmothers, but that doesn't justify the violent acts of adolescent men. But at least by understanding that there's a biological underpinning to that, it gives us some clues as to how we might go about addressing the differential in violence between adolescent men and aging grandmothers, and it also gives us some idea that maybe our resources ought to be pushed more towards the spheres of operation of adolescent men than towards the old people's home where the grandmothers are hanging out. So it's useful information there. I suggest that it might also be useful information here. If you know what the causes of rape are, not just the proximate causes of rape, but the ultimate causes of rape, perhaps, if they exist, I think that's quite useful information in dealing with rape, rather than a stick to beat people with and justify people raping. It's a total red herring she's selling there. So here's the thing then. Seemingly Rebecca Watson sees the greatest danger in proposing biological explanations for things, seemingly whether they're right or wrong, or at least if not biological explanations, specifically explanations that demonstrate some fitness advantage to certain behaviours. I don't want to misrepresent her there. I suggest entirely the opposite, because I've never met a single person who adopts the position that everything is entirely biological, that the differences that you would see between French culture and English culture are explained because there's some kind of genetic difference between the average French person and the average English person. The most extreme that you get on that kind of biological side is people like myself who say, well, it's probably a mixture of the two. There are learned aspects and there are biological aspects, and if there are biological aspects and those biological aspects have come as a result of natural selection, then we would expect there to have been some selection pressures. Wouldn't it be interesting if we knew what those selection pressures were? That is the most extreme position. So it isn't a case of A, cultural, or B, biological. You do get some people who are at the extreme end of the spectrum, and their solutions are almost entirely culturally, societally derived. Any differences that they see in behaviour amongst individuals, or similarities that they see similarity between cultures, are all explained on this idea of learned behaviours, on the idea of passing down culture. So it's not A or B, it's A or A and B. So which is the worst way to be wrong there? Well, I propose to you the worst way to be wrong is if you think that it's just A and that turns out to be wrong, because then you're going to miss out some factors entirely. And when it comes to proposing solutions to problems in society, if you select A and B, well, the worst it's going to be is that some of your efforts are going to be badly invested, and perhaps you won't get a maximal return. When it comes to solving problems of rape and violence, aggression, theft, any of these things, maybe some of your solutions will not be maximal. But if you assume there isn't a biological component, that there is no fitness advantage that's been conferred to individuals in the dim and distant past, then the solutions that you propose won't be informed by that at all. And if that was a significant factor, then you're not going to have taken account of that whatsoever. So I propose to you that unless we know for definite that something isn't involved, that the practical, pragmatic thing to do is to keep all those cards on the table and try and work on the assumption that they could all be involved, and allow that to inform the solutions that we go for. That's the least dangerous. Entirely the opposite of what Rebecca Watson, I think, implies from the talk that she gave. But just last but not least, just want to think about the hypocrisy of this. As you know, I got involved in another one of PZ Myers' threads the other week. If you've watched a couple of my recent videos, you'll know about that, and the talk there was about the patriarchy, and it's very ironic really that when you deal with people from the free thought blogs end of the spectrum, the reasoning is this, and this is the social science kind of reasoning that they've got, that everything's cultural anyway, and so here it goes, here's how it works. We live in a patriarchy, we experience discrimination, therefore that discrimination must be as a result of living in a patriarchy. And seemingly that's all the evidence that you need. That's acceptable, and that isn't challenged within the in-crowd. And yet, when it comes to a biological explanation, I'm damn sure that not just Rebecca Watson, but none of the people that I was talking to the other day would accept that, would accept me saying, we know that natural selection has occurred and natural selection must have happened on humans, therefore any behaviour that we exhibit we have to assume must be as a result of natural selection. They'd want way more than that. I'd want more than that. Why don't they want more than that when it's a social and cultural explanation? Why are they satisfied with such a lower threshold of evidence? I suggest to you, all that does is that just shows off their biases. That's pretty much all I've got to say on this. Please, please, please take my advice. Watch Rebecca's video. Look at the Skeptic Inc. Blog article that's been written by Edward Clint in response to it, and make up your own mind. See where you think with regard to it all. Thanks for watching this video. Really, thanks for watching. Bye for now.